Hi, my name is Vedika.
My name is Kana.
My name is Jigisha.
And my name is Ria. This video will discuss civil rights in America from 1961 through 1969.
American and national identity.
During the Civil Rights Movement, American identity was in a tenuous spot, with African Americans fighting to be regarded as equal to white Americans. This helped shape not only the identity of Black people, but also that of American youth. It was young people that truly embraced the struggle for social justice and fought against racism, as well as poverty, war, and censorship. The SNCC, or Student Non-Violating Coordinating Committee, coordinated peaceful protests against segregation. Students were also responsible for staging numerous sit-ins at segregated lunch counters. They wanted to increase Black political power in the South, and so would walk around Southern towns encouraging Black people to register to vote. It was these students that would grow up to form the New Left. In March 1965, Martin Luther King Jr. led a group of nonviolent demonstrators, including the SNCC and Southern Christian Leadership Council, to the Capitol in Montgomery, Alabama, in order to register Black voters in the South. Known as Bloody Sunday because police officers hit people with clubs and used tear gas, the incident was televised and raised awareness about voting rights.
The Congress of Racial Equality recruited civil rights activists, and on May 4, 1961, they pursued freedom rides, traveling through the American South in order to protest segregation in interstate bus terminals. A mixed group of both Black and white activists would go to segregated areas and use the facilities designated for the opposite race. While their buses were often set on fire and riders beaten, they gained international attention. By 1961, the Interstate Commerce Commission, or the ICC, issued regulations prohibiting segregation in bus and train stations nationwide.
The unity that activists had displayed with the Freedom Rides would be required throughout the rest of the movement as well, among both blacks and whites. The March on Washington would test this. By this point, there was a lot of division within the movement. Some believed that Kennedy's newly proposed civil rights bill wasn't radical enough, while others, like Martin Luther King Jr., encouraged these small steps. Despite these inner tensions, however, activists united and marched in Washington Mall to express support for the new bill, as well as discuss needs for economic equality. The event culminated with King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech. Freedom Summer was another example of unity among activists. It was a voter registration project in Mississippi held by white and black student activist groups. In the process, 2 white students were murdered, which only served to reiterate the urgency of pending the Civil Rights Bill.
To protest racial segregation, the SCLC launched a campaign in Birmingham, Alabama. Eugene Bull Connor, the Public Safety Commissioner in Birmingham, used fire hoses and brutal force to subdue this public demonstration. Pictures of such police brutality were viewed across the nation, evoking both sympathy and horror. MLK was arrested during this campaign, and while he was in jail, he wrote the Letter from Birmingham Jail. These letters addressed racial injustice and paved the way for the Civil Rights Act. It shaped national identity as the entire nation came to realize the extent of segregation in the South.
Politics and power.
In the election of 1960, the presidential race between Republican Richard Nixon and Democrat John F. Kennedy took place. Kennedy won the election by a very slim margin. In his inaugural speech, he famously said,
"Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty."
In reality, his office would not push for civil rights as emphatically as many had hoped. Reluctant to alienate conservative Southern Democrats in Congress, Kennedy refused to push for civil rights legislation. Instead, he appointed many African Americans to high-level positions and strengthened the Civil Rights Commission.
However, violence in the nation was erupting and tensions threatened the nation's security. In 1962, Kennedy ordered U.S. Marshals to protect James Meredith. He was the first black student to attend the University of Mississippi, causing white mobs to attack him. Kennedy was forced to subdue the white mobs with the use of marshals. Then, in June 1963, civil rights leader Medgar Evers was murdered in Mississippi.
Consequently, Kennedy gave the Civil Rights Address calling for unity on what he now called a moral issue.
Then, on November 22, 1963, Kennedy was assassinated. Lyndon B. Johnson, a Southerner from Texas, assumed presidency. As a great supporter of civil rights, Johnson would go on to pass many important legislations, including the Civil Rights Act, which ended discrimination based on race and gender, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which allowed the federal government to oversee voter registration in counties where African American registration was low. By also outlawing literacy tests and poll taxes, this act increased the number of black votes. In 1967, Johnson would also appoint the first African American Supreme Court Justice, Thurgood Marshall.
As the civil rights movement was gaining traction, some activists pushed for power as well as rights. In 1964, a rallying cry for Black Power was heard in order to fight poverty and substandard housing. This culminated into the Black Panthers Party. This revolutionary political party used aggressive rhetoric and strong self-defense. As confrontational activities increased, the civil rights movement took a turn, and people like Malcolm X advocated for black separatism.
In the election of 1964, Republican Barry Goldwater and Lyndon B. Johnson were vying for the position. Goldwater opposed the Civil Rights Bill and the Social Security system. He believed that individual liberty was more important than equality. Johnson, on the other hand, was an avid supporter of civil rights. This created tension with the Southern Democrats as the Democratic Party was exclusively white. This tension culminated at the 1964 Democratic National Convention. The Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, a racially mixed delegation, was acknowledged by Johnson. Although he lost their support when trying to compromise with the Southern white representatives, Johnson would go on to win the election in a landslide. From there, he launched his plan of the Great Society, calling for the elimination of poverty and racial injustice.
Work, exchange, and technology.
The 1960s would revolutionize TV and would be the first time a presidential debate would be televised. Kennedy, more comfortable in the front of the camera, would eventually win the election against Nixon. This significance of the TV would extend across the civil rights movement as well. By 1960, 90% of Americans had a TV that they used to stay in touch with the movement.
As David Brinkley stated, television showed the American people to the American people, and this allowed them to connect with what was happening in Selma, Montgomery, and all over the country. Americans felt both empathy and horror as they watched the brutality blacks faced, something which many had been unaware of before TV.
Lyndon B. Johnson had his own ideas as to how America should be. He passed many bills to achieve the Great Society, or one with no poverty. Under his administration, poverty in America decreased significantly.
And this administration today, here and now, declares unconditional war on poverty in America.
His efforts to equalize Americans were also in favor of civil rights, and he would take landmark steps towards racial equality.
After the Sputnik was launched, the United States created the National Aeronautic and Space Administration in order to compete with the Soviet Union. Although very few Americans knew at the time, Kennedy had allowed African Americans to take part in the space race effort. NASA hired African American mathematicians, scientists, and engineers to advance in the space race, creating higher-level job opportunities for African Americans. These blacks, including Julius Montgomery, broke color barriers through education and employment.